Evening, everyone. Happy New Year to you all. It's not too late to be saying that, I hope. Great to see so many of you here in the great room, and also so many I know online listening in. Please join in the conversation online as well. You can do so by posting your questions in the chat, and indeed across our social media using the hashtag RSA Courage. I'm Andy Haldane, I'm Chief Executive here at the RSA. This is the first of our series of lectures for 2024, our public program. And as the hashtag suggested, the theme of that lecture series this year is courage. In this, the RSA's 270th anniversary year, we thought courage... 270. A mere 270, Justin. We'll be hearing from a whole range of public figures who are both living and leading on issues around courage, around compassion, and doing so with real conviction. Mold breakers and original thinkers who are, in the words we use to describe the RSA's own mission, seeking to regenerate people, places, and, of course, the planet, and doing so not just here in the UK, but right around the world. Given, as you all know, the many and various challenges that we face economically and societally and environmentally, hard to think of a better time to be moving forward with that radical courage if we are to bring about that meaningful change. But where do we find the resources, either within ourselves or beyond, to begin to grow and to spread that courage? Well, to help us all explore answers to that question, and doubtless many others this evening, I'm honoured and personally thrilled to be able to welcome to the RSA this evening our keynote speaker, the Most Reverend and Right Honourable Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury. You all know Justin. He became the 105th Archbishop of Canterbury back in 2013, having previously been Bishop of Durham, Dean of Liverpool Cathedral, and Canon of Coventry Cathedral. He has published several very highly regarded books, rightly highly regarded books, including Reimagining Britain. I think we'll touch upon that this evening, Justin, and The Power of Reconciliation. Justin's also a member of the High-Level Advisory Board on Mediation for the UN. I initially read that as meditation for the UN, but it's mediation.
It is mediation, yes.
And was recently personally honoured, rightly honoured by King Charles for his role in and around the coronation. I hope you'll agree with me. It'd be hard to imagine a more distinguished speaker at a better time to open up our Courage series than the one we have here this evening. So please join me in welcoming to the lectern Archbishop Justin Welby. Justin.
Thank you. Good evening, and it's a huge privilege to be here today. Just in case anyone's wondering, there is no significance in the colour of chair that I chose. I've become, after 11 years in this job, slightly paranoid about people misreading the signals. Just because it's pink, it doesn't mean I'm left of centre. It's very nice. I don't know, where's the camera? For the online, is it over there? Lovely. It's very nice to be with you as well. I'm delighted to be here today and to inaugurate this series of lectures of the RSA on the theme of courage. In 2017, in a book called Reimagining Britain, which Andy mentioned, I highlighted courage as one of the 3 key values needed in a flourishing society. Courage, alongside community and stability, is part of the deep magic, as C.S. Lewis refers in the Narnia books, the deep magic which has underpinned our society for centuries, helping us to understand what is good in absolute and permanent terms. Courage is one of the dynamic group of values which relate most closely to the needs of our future, to the calls of being a society that exercises love in action, and to the nature of human beings. Courage is an area of vast variety, from the toddler who's cut their knee and is told to be brave when a plaster, or in my childhood, TCP, anyone remember that stuff? Ooh, doesn't it sting? Is put on, to the soldier on the battlefield, to the mother sheltering her children during the Hamas attacks on 7th of October, or in Gaza today, or the martyrs like the bishop in Africa in 2008, who, when a militia came to his compound, knelt in front of its commander and told him that before they killed the sheltering refugees, they must kill him. They turned in shame at his courage and his lack of hatred or threats. There are also those in leadership who need to show courage, and it is on them that I shall focus today. I'm talking especially about political leadership, but it can apply more widely. Their courage needs resilience, the willingness to challenge accepted ideas and patterns, like John Maynard Keynes, my favorite economist. I shall come back to him later. But courage, like many virtues, has a dark side. Generosity can become manipulative. Even love can be possessive. Stability can change into stagnation, community into oppression. It is in the holding of all together that each may be powerful in virtue and defended against vice. And in Christian thinking, I should say at this point that the supreme example of courage is Jesus Christ, who, because he revealed the nature of God, revealed courage as part of the image of divinity placed in us all. My thinking is governed and shaped by faith in him, which may not be entirely a surprise given the job I hold. It may even be a slight reassurance. As we begin 2024, we face crises and challenges on multiple fronts, and we live in a context where there is an absence of bandwidth. Internationally, there are new and ongoing conflicts. Russia and Ukraine, Israel and Gaza, and those which have slipped from our news feeds, but continue nevertheless, like Sudan and South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the South Caucasus, Afghanistan. The UN counts 56 conflicts in the world that it is involved in mediation with or trying to have some influence, positive influence in. Then we have migration, more and more driven by climate change. It is a global and generational problem which feeds on war, economics, and inequality, and which is also driven by them. And these 4 horsemen of the apocalypse feed on each other's work and collectively block solutions to any single one. The head of the International Panel on Climate Change estimates that at our present level of increase in global temperatures, and we're heading towards 2.5 degrees, never mind 1.5, we're looking at least a 10 to 12-fold increase in the number of people who are forced to move from their homes. And that's only taking into account the climate impact, not the innumerable conflicts that will generate, the collapses in economics, and therefore the self-fulfilling downward spiral. Economically, we face trade wars, protectionism, soaring public debt, a growing gap between north and south, rich and poor, and rising absolute levels of poverty and destitution. Andy reminded me a few minutes ago of something I remember from Liverpool, and it hasn't changed, that if you go 5 miles north of the centre of the city and you live there, you will lose 15 years in life expectancy. Socially, there are deep divisions within our communities, high levels of loneliness and mental health problems, especially in the wealthier countries, and the realities of an aging population with the care requirements that that brings. Religiously, in many parts of the world, religious militant fundamentalism has grown as a marginal but destructive part of every global religion, and over 80% of the world belongs to one religion or another. The origin of this feature of faith is not divine, but is very human, I suggest, above all as a means of circling the wagon and keeping out the intellectual, economic, and social challenges of modernity, which themselves give hope. Technologically and scientifically, the next 40 years will see greater change than any equivalent period in history. If this is a feature of the wealthy world only, then the outcome will make the inequalities of the 19th century, for example, at the Battle of Omdurman, where a British imperial force 1/6 the size of the Mahdi's army, but equipped with Gatling guns, it will make that kind of difference look small. If the development is for parts of the world dreaming of power and totalitarian rule and not of humility, love, and service, then it will lead to global tyranny unsurpassed in history, even in the mid-20th century. And all this in 2024, when there will be more elections taking place around the world than ever before, albeit some of them will be effectively selections rather than elections. The ideas and the thoughts of most global politicians are on the next months as a result, not the next years or generations. And that leaves us a problem with bandwidth, the incapacity to deal with the range of issues that are faced. And the problem of bandwidth is exacerbated by the speed and diversity of communication technology. In politics, in the church, in diplomacy, in management, in finance and economics, the enormous increase in the speed and reach of communications has completely changed the context of decision-making and of strategy. The instinctive response is to simplify. The necessity is the courage to embrace complexity. Failure to embrace the complexity of a problem leads to solutions that will lead to greater problems. The response to the confusion of our times has in many parts of the world been a surplus of courageous leaders in our time today who are profoundly politically skilled in developing power through populism. They have courage. Carl Schmitt, 1888 to 1985, was one of the most insightful developers of the concepts which lead today to populism, and he was an influential figure, a jurist and political philosopher, in the rise and establishment of Adolf Hitler and of the National Socialist Party in the 1930s in Germany. His development of the ideas of the sovereignty of the one who identifies exceptions from the hegemony of normal politics, and even more of identity being formed through differentiation from the other, have seeped into the mainstream of many political systems. In this thinking, normativism is challenged by the courageous and determined leader, whose will to power does not accept the constraints imposed by the normal and the conventional, the influence of Nietzsche is obvious. At the same time, both as a fundamental basis of government and also as a tool of gaining power, the identification of the other enables the creation of binaries, such as with the people or against the people. A certain newspaper's headline after a judgment a few years back may come to mind. People, in this context, having the elements of the German word Volk. Those who are other may be a large majority, but they are also likely to be disparate, less organized, and regrettably less courageously led. The small, focused, powerful, and brave unit has huge opportunities in the world in which we live with the communications which we use. In this way of thinking, courage is a necessary aspect of the objective of power. Successful populists require courage. They require enemies, and they require resilience. They abhor accountability, checks and balances, questioning, effective opposition. There are no acceptable constraints on action. Populism is on a spectrum, from determined campaigning in an election or determined action in government to totalitarian manipulation in the manner of Hitler or Stalin. Governments slip along the spectrum in one way or another, and change is always possible, and this is where courage plays such a strong part for good or ill. Mandela in Africa, South Africa, Havel, Václav Havel in what was then Czechoslovakia, showed the sacrifice and courage required to move from the dark end of the spectrum to the light, and did it in a way that leaves their names imprinted in history. In Shakespeare's Richard III, in his opening soliloquy, beginning so famously with, "Now is the winter of our discontent," Richard says later on, a few lines later, "I will play the villain." In a wonderful production that Caroline and I saw at Stratford many years ago, Richard played the villain at the beginning until the villain began to play him. In his dream on the eve of the Battle of Bosworth, in the last act, when his victim comes to claim their revenge, he recognizes the price he has paid. It is Faustian. Courage by itself is thus a dubious virtue. In the gospel accounts of the crucifixion of Jesus, he dies between two bandits. Both are courageous. One curses him, the other seeks and finds mercy and salvation. Courage is a dubious virtue. It can go either way. Courage is a dependent virtue. It will go the right way when it is being questioned, when it has limits. It abhors binaries and simplification, and good courage embraces complexity and uncertainty. In his excellent book, The Hour Between Dog and Wolf, John Coates, formerly a bond trader in New York and now a professor of neurosciences at Cambridge, sets out the neurological impact of stress and pressure. In particular, he identifies three contexts that together and separately cause harm to us physiologically. They are uncertainty, unpredictability, and the absence of control. All three stimulate the brain to produce chemicals and hormones, such as adrenaline, which with prolonged and continual exposure develop sense either of powerlessness and anxiety or elation, and that one has superhuman powers. The markets in the approach to and experience of 2008-9 are classic situations for finding both. Courage is a victim or product of the body as well as a personal decision. So courage is a condition that comes from body and mind, from spirit and soul. But what is the human being in which we find courage? What is our anthropology? Given that courage is a dependent virtue and is deeply affected by our bodies as well as our culture, an essential factor in understanding courage in leadership or elsewhere is how we understand what a human being is. Social and psychological anthropology and theological anthropology vary widely by culture, by religious background, including of those who reject any idea of faith, and by intuition. The UK has an implied anthropology in the way society works, which has developed and has been seen before. Although I hope no one would recognize the terms, I will argue that it is essentially an anthropology which involves two ancient Christian heresies, Arminianism and Pelagianism. The latter is known around the theological world as the English heresy because Pelagius was English, and it is a very English error. Arminianism says we can achieve perfection. I'm oversimplifying wildly, but Arminianism says we can achieve perfection in this life. We can live without sin. Or to put it another way, the norm should be for all our institutions and people to get things right. And thus, when things go wrong, it is not fallibility, but fault. Who is to blame is the obvious question. Somebody got it wrong. I remember a BBC Radio 4 interview where the first question I was asked about a particular issue was, who's to blame? You hear it again and again. It is an anthropology that undermines courage, for it creates a blame culture. It is litigious, angry, unforgiving, and makes the exercise of courageous leadership much harder because the cost of failure is so high, especially on social media. It has a deep belief in conspiracy theory rather than cock-up theory. Pelagius believed we could get to heaven by our own efforts. His great opponent, Augustine of Hippo, said that we will always go wrong and need to accept our fallibility and sin and seek God's forgiveness. In the late 19th century and early 20th, a secularized form of Pelagianism led to liberal optimism that believed that with education for all, free trade and democracy, there would be peace and universal prosperity. Remember that even Keynes offered the view in one of his books in the 20s, after that view had gone, that by now we would have 15-hour working weeks and a vast flourishing of the arts. I wish. It was a view, the liberal optimism, the secularized Pelagianism, that was much damaged by the Great War and received the coup de grace in World War II and the Holocaust. But long years of peace have renewed it. Do we really believe in this country in human evil? In widespread human evil? Or do we believe that people are good if they're led well? Ultra-modernity instills in us a hermeneutic of suspicion. Paxman once said, I always start interviews asking myself what this liar is going to lie about today. That is as good a definition of a hermeneutic of suspicion as you can get. Social media has no space for forgiveness, for space to fail, let alone for nuanced understanding. And again, that impacts on courage in leaders. It raises the barrier to courage because the consequences of failure are so terrible. It diminishes the support of risk. It atomizes the networks of those who can accompany us and help us. Every major decision involves a wager of your whole future, and the body reacts severely to such stress. In our senior leadership training in the Church of England, yes, we do it nowadays, begun about 9 years ago, those who participate end their 2 years of 12 days a year with an archbishop, sort of punishment, accompanied with the archbishop accompanying them on a place of horror. Auschwitz, Srebrenica, places like that. They hear the stories. They reflect and pray and meditate and hear lectures. And when they are asked, and when they get home, they are asked to reflect deeply and write and go and see their bishop with their conclusions on human nature. Because for most of them, the systematic industrialized evil of a place like Auschwitz, the extraordinary killing of Srebrenica and its ongoing impact, the terrorism encountered by those who were involved in it in Northern Ireland, those are things they've not come up against on the whole. Those things that possess our whole society. But Christian teaching is that human beings are naturally curved in on themselves, selfish and so forth, power-seeking and avaricious, but eminently redeemable and forgivable when their lives are focused on others through being committed to Christ, who sets free by grace in forgiveness. In secular life, that translates into structures of mediation, no-blame cultures, patience with learning, and reflection honestly on both failure and success. Finally, 2 comments on the need for political courage. The absence of courageous leadership has the most terrible consequences in world affairs. The 1930s opposed weak and worried leaders to powerful and courageous tyrants. Courageous but of the dark side, as they say in Star Wars. And evil ruled. History is not repetitious, I believe. It's not a circle, but a line in which the future is unpredictable, the present is incomprehensible, and the past gives us only occasional flashes of light. The struggle to lead amidst bandwidth inadequacy and a hostile and punitive culture is one that requires courage of the right kind. Today we have the courageous leaders in the world with a desire for power and little constraint on action, except that which they see as achievable. They are not all evil, or at the very least, we do not know that they are. That is usually only a valid judgment in history. But they seek a very different kind of world and a very different framework of freedom and dissent. They have access to weapons very different from the past, and also weapons very new. With them, they seek to convict, convert, and conquer. The courageous leadership that is required needs a number of aspects if it is not to be corrupted by the exercise of its own strength. It must carry a decisive vision. We saw that in Lincoln, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Reagan, Churchill, Attlee, Thatcher, Blair. We observed it in Monnet, Adenauer, de Gaulle, and many others. We may differ with any or all of them, but they set out ideas well formulated in opposition and in government. Certainly obstructed by events, inevitably failing in many of their dreams, they did not believe in their own infallibility and were accompanied, like Lincoln, by a company of rivals. They drew on deep thinking in numerous areas, from philosophy through the sciences. Courage is honest. In their vision, those courageous leaders analyzed and spoke of what they looked for, what they saw in comprehensible terms, and they contrasted it with the situation they found with rigorous realism and what Kissinger called pitiless honesty. Courage, secondly, must have achievable aims, and I've taken these 3 things from an interview with Kissinger in The Economist on 27th of May last year. Courage must have achievable aims. A symptom of courage in leadership are aims and the dedication of means that goes further than the average politician or leader. Kennedy's moonshot speech is one of them. Attlee's extraordinary list of changes, statutory and in policy, and of decolonisation in one parliament is possibly a greater one. Courage must relate those aims, especially when they're overseas, to the needs and hopes of domestic life. The Butler Education Act was in 1944, the year of D-Day, long before the end of the war. The Beveridge Report, even more, 1942. What an extraordinary moment of courage. The next election here poses questions in economics of productivity, stagnation, equality, infrastructure, and many others. It poses questions of rearmament, of the means and ways to peace, and of foreign policy, on which depend not only our security, but our contribution to the rest of the world. It has high challenges in health, housing, university, and other further education. It has, in this election, in other words, to at least set a vision for this nation's place and prominence in the world. And finally, a comment on the schools of political and public courage. Where do we learn it? For it is not in our DNA. The courageous are not born so, but made so. It's in our education and formation, in the examples we have from good mentors, and in the way we can learn to take risks which have low consequences and build on them. Archbishop William Temple, I think one of the greatest of my extraordinary predecessors, wrote Christianity and Social Order in 1942. He and Beveridge and Tawney were close friends from school days onwards, a remarkable collection. It sold 250,000 copies. I wish. One of his greatest chapters is on intermediate institutions, those organizations and groups that are between the state and the family. I argued in my very sub-Temple 2017 book, which did not sell 250,000 copies, on reimagining Britain, that they range from clubs and societies, schools and colleges, churches, hospitals, charities, companies, local authorities, and many others. Intermediate institutions are training centers for courageous leadership. Their renewal is essential to developing courage. In them, there is the necessary accountability, challenge, opportunity to fail and recover, and the place of developing friendships of accountability. Their encouragement, not their management, should be a value of government if we are to build strength for the future. Regulation of too many of these groups is too often aiming at perfection when it should be content with the prevention of harm. I speak as leader of a church which has serious internal issues, internal differences on a range of issues. I won't talk about them. And in this, we are an example of a bigger social truth. The fact that the ability to disagree as fellow human beings rather than as enemies seems increasingly elusive in our culture and not only our churches. Courage rests on values that are absolute, not hating others, for example, but loving your enemy, not dividing the country for the sake of political advantage, the use of so-called wedge issues, where unity is an absolute need for our flourishing. It is necessary to inspire, and that needs courage, and to be realistic about aims, and that needs courage. Courage requires at any level seeking to serve, not to be served. A political culture that sees politics as a step along the way to wealth is built on sand and will be corrupted. We see both. As I said on the 1st of January on the Today programme, I believe passionately there is no problem so bad in this country that we have not shown in the past that we have the capacity to overcome it. We have an extraordinary story of overcoming the greatest obstacles, rising above our worst selves and coming together when we need to. We can do so again. But to do so, we must set our sights on developing courage of the right kind across our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin, for a wonderful and wonderfully insightful lecture. Let's jump into straight some questions because time is fairly short. I'll maybe kick off with one sent in and then I'll go to the audience and we'll gather some in clusters so we get through as many as possible by just after 7.
Fine.
And here's one sent in, Justin. I couldn't resist asking you this one. It says, in an ever-changing world driven by technology, is AI slowly taking over the role of God?
Well, we've got very little time, so I need to be brief about that. No. Because any more than, say, the antibiotics or medicine takes over the role of God, God is over all these things. Our responsibility is to use them well. We must not be afraid of developments in science and technology, but we must be realistic about ourselves and our ability to misuse them.
Very good. Little ripple there, big ripple. Let's go to the audience and collect some questions, maybe in patches of blocks of 3. We'll start here. Do you want to just wait for the microphone? It's just behind you.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. You did start off with a very pessimistic and depressing picture of the world situation. And I wonder if you could balance that by giving 1 or 2 examples of individuals whom you think do display courage, perhaps like Balbir Singh, that wonderful schoolmistress.
Yes, and from the same, from the Balbir Singh, you can see it in numerous places in education in this country. I could point to a dozen schools without thinking very hard, which do show this extraordinary development of personality and hope, both secular and religious of various kinds. I can also look at people like Malala, whose courage is, I've met her a couple of times, I just come away awed. There's a doctor in the DRC, in the eastern DRC, not far from Goma, who set up and run a hospital for women who'd suffered sexual violence in conflict. And his courage under enormous threat from local militias, he got the Nobel Prize, is remarkable. I do see many individuals who show great courage, and I see some governments that show great courage, and where one begins to see things turning round rapidly in countries that have gone through very hard times. One of the great examples in the last 20 years, I think, is Chile. Many, many problems. The problems continue. There's no faultless society, but they have recovered from the appalling nature of their military government. And a last one, this will be more controversial, but I'm feeling irresponsible. Rwanda. When Caroline and I first went to Rwanda and spent time with people who'd seen huge numbers of their families killed, the fact, yes, there are huge problems. There are problems of democracy, but there is also stability. There is also a lack of fear there. I'm not getting into that issue, but I do admire what has been achieved if you see the difference from 1993.
Thank you. Gentleman here.
Mohammed Barbadani. Two questions, if I may. But before that, Andy, we need him more back in here. We need the speaker to come more times. One time lecture is not enough. Okay. Two questions, if I may. Everything our distinguished speaker said is excellent, but how much of it is done in schools?
Thank you.
Secondly, we are very good at killing each other, but not embracing each other. What can one do?
Thank you.
Do you want me to take another couple and then...
Let's take a couple, yes. Maybe just in front here as well, to save us moving a mic around, and then maybe one at the back.
Thank you. After the Second World War, Field Marshal Slim wrote an essay called Courage, and you've obviously read it. And he postulated that every individual has a finite amount of courage, different amounts, but finite. Do you think that societies, populations, countries also have a finite amount of courage?
Another great question. Hold that thought, Justin, and we'll take one more just the back. Just behind you, actually, sir. There's a microphone behind you.
Thank you very much, both of you. Your Grace, given that this century promises to start in the context of the climate and biodiversity crises to start looking quite like the last book of the New Testament, what sort of courage do you think the Church should be instilling in us now?
Okay, I will try and answer very briefly. I'm known for long answers, but I'm going to resist it. How much is done in schools? It depends on the leadership and the courage of the leadership in the school, sir. I know a lot of schools where, I'll give you one example in Darlington when I was just become Bishop of Durham. It was a school that had been turned, it had a very high traveller and Roma Gypsy participation, about 25%. It had been in special measures. They brought in a new head. It was a church school. It is a church school. They brought in a new head. In 4 years, many of those travellers and Roma Gypsy were influential in the school. The head boy and head girl both came from those communities. They had learned leadership and courage to, in a way that was, it was most beautiful school, and integrated. And that was leadership and courage by the head. It's easy to, yes, there's a wonderful book by Wolf called Exclusion and Embrace, making exactly the point. It is easier to exclude than to embrace, but it is only easier in the short term. The nature of conflict, whether violent or not, is the center gets hollowed out, the edges become less ethical, and people begin to think it's easier to separate than to join up. And the reality is that is not true, and we find that that the extremes begin to consume themselves. So encounter, funnily enough, I'm doing something on this in schools tomorrow, encounter, listening, training in handling difference is doable, and we do it a lot in prisons at the moment. We've developed a course for working in prisons on this. Slim, one of my greatest heroes. He's a wonderful man, and his great book on defeat into victory is absolutely extraordinary. There is a finite amount of courage in any human being. I think that my experience of working in areas of conflict for many years is that where the society is functional, that can be compensated for, and a country can find new strength by caring for its weakest, so that they can in turn care for those who become weak. But it is a costly and requires a strong community and a strong basis of common values. Courage, I've just written here, courage for a time of year. I can't remember why I wrote that. It was...
The crisis, the climate and biodiversity crisis. If we're in a sixth mass extinction,
Oh, yes, that's right. The end of Narnia, indeed, rather worse than that, actually, the book of Revelation and the four horsemen of the apocalypse. I think the courage, the sort of courage we need there is very much that of integrity about the depth of the challenges we face. If you, one of my great heroes is Winston Churchill, partly because my mother worked for him in between 49 and 55 as his personal secretary, and so I grew up on Churchill stories and so on. His great speech when he took office in May 1940 was, "I have nothing to offer you but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." That is a courageous speech because it does not diminish the difficulties of the situation. That is the courage we need at this time.
Another bundle of questions on this side of the room, starting here, sir, before we wrap things up.
Thank you for your presentation. I enjoyed it. You made a distinction between different types of courage and suggested that the best type of courage is characterized by mediation and an acceptance of our fallibility. Isn't there a point at which engaging in too much mediation and too much conversation without taking a stand can also be a form of failure of courage?
Thank you.
Thank you. Behind it. And one more here. Sorry, yeah. We'll take one more.
Yes, can you hear?
We can.
Indeed.
Looking at the churches, in all the churches, if you look at the Muslims, the splits between Sunni and Shiite. If you look at the Anglican Church, you've had splits. In the Catholic Church, they've changed a lot. Then you look at the Ukraine Orthodox Church, breaking away from Russia, which was one of the instigators of that war. All of these are faith-based. They have a belief. They have a way of living. What is stopping all the churches getting together as organizations of faith with a defined way of living to help beat the protagonists of war? Because you're going to have it continuously unless we can get faith being a hallmark of society.
Thank you, sir.
Was there a final question on this side of the room? Sir, here.
Could I ask you about trust? It's my perception that high-trust societies, high-trust communities it's easier to display courage. Communities that fear, it's much more difficult to display courage. I'd just like your thoughts on that, please.
Thank you. Mediation, not taking a stand, can be failure. Yes, I would also say it's bad mediation. Part of mediation, one of the key elements of mediation, is understanding the other. It is, we talk about 3 habits of peacemaking. One is being present with the other, so you see them as a human being. The second is being curious, so you understand their story to the point where you can tell them their story and they recognize it as such, and vice versa. And the third is reimagination. Now, that must involve knowing where the red lines are. And not taking a stand can be a failure. We saw that in the mid-30s, 1930s, and there are numerous examples now. Human fallibility and evil means there will be wars, because there'll be miscalculation and there will be people who will not compromise or will manipulate. Munich. But mediation must be a first point, because that gives you the opportunity to find a better way forward. Though you have to be aware that many mediations fail. So I sort of half agree. Faith-based, what is stopping churches getting together? Not a lot. Last Wednesday, we flew off to Rome, and I spent time with the Pope, and with he and I commissioned 30 Roman Catholic, 30 Anglican bishops from around the world for their joint mission and work in their often incredibly dangerous and difficult areas together. They then came to Canterbury on, I can't remember which day, Friday I think it was, and continued, and we finished off on Sunday evening, and it's just the way the diary worked. Yesterday and today I was in Norwich with 20 Roman Catholic and 20 Church of England bishops working on what we do in this country. We work extremely closely with Muslim leaders, Jewish leaders, Hindu leaders, Sikh leaders, particularly on social issues. What is stopping churches and faiths getting together? Because they've got too many human beings in them. And it comes back to your anthropology. And finally, trust. I couldn't agree more. Courage brings trust, and trust brings courage. It's a virtuous circle. It takes huge courage to be the first one to trust. That's where the courage comes in.
Justin, we're in overtime already, but I can't resist one more question sent in online to finish us off. It's a policy one. We're in an election year, as you know, and the question is, what single courageous policy would you like to see in the manifestos of any of the any of the parties, actually, if you get the main ones?
Only one.
Only one.
Only one. I'm going to be boringly predictable. I would like to see us going back to 0.7% of GDP on international development. And using the whole 0.7 much more intentionally split up between long-term process, but also to reduce the push factor in migration, because migration is bad for the country losing its most get-up-and-go people, because they've all got up and gone. And it, as we know, is a struggle with many of our communities, our poorest communities, because they're very welcoming and they are good people, but they feel overwhelmed. And that feeling is a reality. We cannot ignore reality. I'm Bishop in Canterbury Diocese. South Coast of Kent is where it's all happening, and we see that day to day. So that would be, I suppose, a really courageous one. I could throw out a dozen things on education, universities, and I'm not going to go anywhere near rearmament, because I'm bound to get into trouble with everyone as opposed to just most people.
Listen, we should probably draw things to a close. Thank you, everyone, for coming along, both online and in the room. It's been a wonderful, wonderful discussion. For those of you that are fellows, the conversation need not end. You can join in the conversation on our digital platform, Circle, after this evening. For those that aren't fellows, it's never too late. Check out our website to join. It's so lovely in January to have a full congregation, Justin.
I'm not used to full congregations. You know the old story about the bishop who goes to a church and it's mostly empty? And he says to the vicar, did you tell them I was coming? And the vicar says, no, I didn't, my lord, but word must have got out somehow.
With that, thank you all again for your questions, for coming along. How lucky we are to be in this great room and to have heard such a great speaker utter such words of wisdom. So please join me in welcoming and thanking profusely the fantastic Archbishop Justin Welby.